What is the best way to explain the hypostatic union? What is the best way? Well, it depends, really, doesn't it? Because it depends what you're explaining it against, what you're explaining it to. I mean, most recently, I've thought of an analogy to try and explain how the hypostatic union doesn't lead to change within the divinity, and the analogy is the analogy between fresh water and salt water, or fresh water and ionized water. Because ionized water, salt water, is water that has extra ions collected by minerals that the water on its way to the sea is picked up on its journey over land. So it takes with it these salts, these ions, into the sea. And these ions, when they are mixed with the H2O, they create a heavier water. So heavier water, it's heavier than fresh water. We can't drink it. It affects what kind of organisms can live in it. But no one would say that salt water and fresh water are different in substance. Everyone would say that they are the same thing, and that they haven't changed their substance, their nature, the thing that makes them water, H2O. That hasn't changed by the attachment to the ions, by the mixing with the ions that are now part and parcel of the seawater. So the analogy is of the divinity. So all the talk of the fresh water and the salt water is talking about the divinity, and the ions, the salt, is the idea of taking the humanity onto the divinity. Because as Christians, we don't believe that the divine changes into a human being. We believe that the divine remains unchanged and takes onto himself a humanity, which then makes the divinity operate in this world differently than it would from a non-incarnate divinity. So that would be one analogy that I would use. Another analogy that you could use is the idea of light as both photon and wave. Light displays the properties of both photon and wave, but it doesn't change depending. It doesn't display them at exactly the same time. So when it's behaving like a wave, it's not behaving like a photon. When it's behaving like a photon, it's not behaving like a wave. But it's still light. It hasn't changed. It's light when it's a photon, it behaves like a photon, and it's light when it behaves like a wave. And so it is the same with Christ. It is the one person, Christ, who operates in both his human nature and his divine nature. And we speak of because we're speaking of the one Christ, when we don't talk of him as being two persons, because there's only one person in Christ. So whether he's acting out of his human nature or of his divine nature, we speak of him as just one. And so what we say of Christ acting in one of his natures is said for the totality of the person. So an example would be when we say Christ died, we don't say, we say that Christ dies in his humanity. And what that means is that the divinity passes through death completely untouched, without interacting with it in any way. But it goes through death because the person of Christ has gone through death, but the divinity doesn't die. And I think that Muslims really have to get to grips with what we believe, rather than simply creating their straw man arguments based upon things that we don't believe.